one of the other interesting things is that Jeffrey and I were having a discussion at the beginning, sort of hypothesizing, what are we going to find? And we were curious, are they going to be more character-driven or more story-driven? To which we found out,
neither.
Wrong. They all did the same thing. They said, conflict.
I'm your host, Danny Brassell, and it is my pleasure today to have with me two very funny individuals, Peter Desberg and Jeffrey Davis, the co-authors of Show Me the Funny. Thank you so much for coming today, guys.
Having us.
So where did you get the title, Show Me the Funny?
The publisher.
That's where all good titles come from. They say, oh, here's our titles. Oh, good, here's the one we'll use.
Well, good. So what inspired you guys to write this book?
Well, it has a long, illustrious history. It started back decades ago. One night I'm at home leading my boring life, and I get a call out of the blues. A woman says, I'm getting my master's degree in psychology at Antioch West, and I want to do something on the psychology of humor. Would you help me? Would you be on my committee? They said, it's okay. What are you doing? Well, I'm going to write a chapter on the psychology of humor, one on the sociology of humor, one on the anthropology of humor, and then I'm going to interview a famous Hollywood comedy writer. Who? Edmund Hartman. I don't know if you know who Edmund Hartman is.
Tell us all.
He wrote 3 of the best Bob Hope movies, wrote a bunch of Abbott and Costello movies. Wasn't he the first president of the Writers Guild?
He was.
This guy's like royalty. I say, how do you know him? He said, oh, he's my dad. And I said, all right, how about if we scrap the first 3 chapters? Can your dad get some of his friends to be interviewed? Well, that's no problem. So we got these folks. And we decided that instead of just asking them questions about what they do and how they do it, we would pose a bunch of problems for them that writers encounter and actually watch them work. We started getting these great writers, Hal Cantor, Herbie Baker, wonderful people. And after the 8th interview, I was in heaven. This is the most enjoyable project I ever did. Get a phone call. Hi, Peter, this is Susie. I guess this is bad news. In 2 weeks, I'm moving to Illinois. Can't do the project. Bye. Dagger. So depressed about it, but it lifted after a couple of decades. So one night, I'm at home, lead a very boring life, and unbeknownst to me, Jeffrey is parked outside my house because his kid was playing with my kid, and it was his duty to come and drive him home. In typical curmudgeonly fashion, he's sitting there saying, please come out, please don't make me have to go in and get you, which means I have to meet more parents and start that conversation. Oh, what do you do? Of course, the kid didn't come out. Jeffrey had to come up. And then at some point, oh, you're a college professor too, so am I. And after grousing and comparing horror stories, he said, I'm a writer. I write mostly plays now. I've written for TV. I've done all kinds of stuff. But now they want me to do academic writing. Do you do any academic writing? I said, yeah, I have way too much of it. So for some reason, this project popped into my head, and I said, let me tell you a story. And Jeffrey said, who are some of the writers? And each time that I'm mentioning another writer, his eyes are going like this. And he said, I grew up with all those people around me. They were at the house playing poker with my father. Jeffrey's dad was a very well-known writer in Hollywood. What are some of the shows that your dad
Bewitched, That Girl, Odd Couple. Before that, he was a writer at at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer back in what is now referred to as the Golden Age.
Yeah.
Esther Williams movies, things like that.
That's great.
Yeah, he was not just a writer on those shows, but the showrunner for those shows.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the head writer plus. So all of a sudden he jumps up and says, "Let's do it." And we decided to resurrect the project. It was very close to Easter, I think, when we had this conversation.
Excellent.
So we resurrected the project, and Jeffrey came up with a great idea of, instead of individual questions and problems, why don't we just write a premise and say, here, develop it. So tell him the...
Well, I think that's an interesting approach that you did the book. It made it much more interesting, I think, for the writers being interviewed. There, you gave them. So let's talk about the premise.
Well, it started really because we said, well, there are plenty of how to write a screenplay books, and we didn't want to add to more of the literature.
Well, you could have made it in how to write a screenplay in 14 days.
Right. But what really we wanted to do was to show that there are as many ways to write as there are writers. So we gave all of these writers, and I'll just give the very simple form of this premise. It was a mother-daughter story, and the mother's husband dies, and she thinks she's being left all this money. The money disappears. She has to move in with the daughter. And where the writers took it is amazing. Some went with the premise we gave them and developed it. Others changed the sex, or made it a mother-son story. And you get to watch them do it. That's the really interesting part. It's not how we wrote. It's really watching them write it.
I was actually surprised how many of them actually took your premise, because in my experience, a lot of them just kind of go off on a tangent.
We gave them that freedom and told them they could do that. But the thing that we were really interested in right from the start is, when you ask somebody to describe what they've done, we have a sort of inside joke we laugh about all the time of the highest form of fiction is the autobiography. And so we didn't want them sort of waxing romantically about what they think they did in the past. We wanted to see it as it happened and to be there in real time with it, which is what made it so exciting. But a number of the people, one of our favorite stories, Elliot Shulman, who was a showrunner for Home Improvement, said, I'm writing a story about my dad, and I'd rather do this as a father and son movie. No problem. And one of the things that we thought was so interesting is he was sort of saying that as comedy writers, we kind of look at the world differently. And he told us this incredible story that his father committed suicide. So he decided, as part of this book he was writing, he called his sister, and they decided to recreate the last ride to the suicide point. So they went out to Riverside Drive, got into a cab, just like his father had done, went to the bridge, and he said, on my way there, he said, you couldn't get a heavier moment. And I started thinking, my dad was a German Jew and kind of cheap. I wonder what he tipped the cab driver on the way to his suicide.
Well, and that's what struck me. There was the interview with Walter Bennett, who wrote for The Cosby Show.
Right.
And he had gotten some advice from Bill Cosby. Cosby had told him, don't write jokes, write what's real. And I thought that was an interesting element. It seemed like most of the writers you interviewed, they really said that it's different writing, a drama than it is a comedy. But real comedy comes from real dramatic situations.
Right. And Phil Rosenthal talks in the book and is also famous for saying that the one rule they had in the writer's room on Raymond was, could this happen? Mm-hmm. And I think over the years we've seen shows that really last are the shows that's the rule for. The thing that also comes out of the book that's really interesting is, because we're interviewing in the way we are hearing Hollywood stories and tricks of the trade that we probably wouldn't hear if it was just a standard, how did you write this? As, for example, the room monkey, which is something, I've been around TV my whole life and I didn't know the term. Do you know what a room monkey is?
Not at all.
Well, the room monkey, you have a room usually of 9 or 10 writers, and you're in there 8 to 12 to 14 hours a day. There has to be somebody in the room who can get the comedy juices flowing when everybody is just
when the energy is down.
Right. And Phil talks about one writer who would go over, take his pants down, and it's a quote from the book, hump the thermostat, and then they would have to say, come back to the table because we need your talent and your energy. So we learned things like that. Why don't you tell the George Burns story that Sherwood Schwartz told us, because I think that is something that couldn't come out in a regular interview book.
Which one you mean?
The one where he worked. I didn't mean where he worked for Bob Hope.
That one I know.
Okay.
It was interesting that Sherwood Schwartz, like us, was a USC graduate student, and he was studying biology and had planned to go to medical school, and his brother was working for Bob Hope, and he was a joke writer, and Sherwood would give him jokes, and at some point he said, hey, why don't you come in and we'll submit some jokes to Bob, and he became a joke writer for Bob Hope, started being one of his main writers, literally went into the Army, was writing jokes, started writing stories and little drama type instead of straight jokes, came back and had a very moving issue where he said, Bob, I can't come back and work for you anymore because I want to do more story-oriented humor and not just write jokes. And I had a sort of very tearful goodbye. But stories like that don't come out unless you're actually in the middle of working on something,
right?
And having something happen.
And my favorite thing that Sherwood Schwartz, and I think it was Sherwood or maybe
and
it was
his son Lloyd,
yeah, in that interview, I loved it because they said what's changed between how writing used to happen and how it writes today is that it used to be they'd look at a show and they're like, oh, that's already been done. We can't do that. And today it's like, oh, that's already been done. We have to do that.
Exactly.
I thought, wow, it's really like have we lost creativity, or what do you explain that for?
Well, they want to be safe. If this works, then we know it'll work again.
Right.
Well, and Jeffrey, that's something that you always ask, which was a good question every single time. It seemed like every interview you're like, okay, how do you make a commercial? Is that something that you see writers worrying about all the time?
Well, they have to now, because as Heidi Perlman, who is an amazing writer, says in the book, you don't just have the network. You might have the network and two separate studios, both of whom own different parts of the show. So now you have three entities on the set giving you notes. But I also, the other side of the commercial is that Phil Rosenthal said the best advice he ever got was from Ed Weinberger, who goes back to the Mary Tyler Moore days, who said, in the end, make the show you want to make because in the end they're going to cancel you anyway. So that's his answer to commercialism. But the interesting thing that Peter was able to do, that, and this is why I think it's going to be a great book for students. I've already given my students complimentary copies because we're trying to see what they can learn from it. Is that Peter had a question that he asked quite often is, could you darken it? And in the particular case of Bob Meyer, when he started very commercial, very safe, and then he
literally he said, I'm going to begin by casting the story, so I have an idea of who's doing it and how commercial they'll be for selling this. And he did this perfect little network drama that he knew this could go on the air, there'd be no trouble, no feathers ruffled.
Yeah, and he wrote kind of a female Sherlock Holmes. He developed the whole story around her having a woman having a cocaine habit that nobody knew about. And at the end, he said, I may sell this. I may try to sell this.
He said, I'm going to pitch it. But the interesting thing with almost all these writers is most of them, they were, one way that you can tell professionals from non is they thought immediately, how do I turn this into something that will actually be commercial? And literally, it was like when you said to them, when we say, well, can you darken this? It was like, imagine their hand on a little dial saying, well, how dark do you want it? And they could deliver. And literally, in the case of, what was also great was since it was a new kind of situation, they thought out loud a lot. So in this case with Bob Meyer's interview, he was saying, okay, so let's take this girl and let's give her a really dark secret. Okay, we'll give her a drug habit. And then he started saying, the drug habit is going to make her sort of one down and people will root for her because she's pretty and we like pretty people. And she's good at what she does, and we like competent people, but this makes her an underdog, and we always like underdogs. So he'd be explaining all this as he's crafting it. And then he built this perfect situation where he said, okay, so she She finally gets the crack in the case. She's meeting with the guy who's going to divulge all the secret information. She goes home for a quick fix, and there's everybody she knows with an intervention.
Right. So he made the pilot the intervention show.
And literally, that's when he jumped and said, I'm going to pitch this.
Well, I think that's what I like the most about writers is how flexible they are. I remember there was a story about Samuel Goldwyn with Billy Wilder, and Billy Wilder was pitching this really dark story about this guy winds up turning into a horse. And Goldwyn's like, what? Get out of here until you give me a happy ending. And Wilder leaves the room and he comes back and he's like, but he goes on to win the Kentucky Derby. I just thought that was great.
Well, it was also interesting, though, that a lot of the writers talked about devices that they use. Charlie Peters, who's an old family friend of Jeffrey's and his wife, told us a great example where he talked about this concept of using a third object. And the example he gave of it was, I don't know if you ever saw the 1920s version of Beauty and the Beast that John Cocteau did, but he said, imagine now, here's the scene where they're having dinner in this idyllic garden setting, this very sweet, innocent girl, this monster of a beast, who's now trying to charm her, and all of a sudden a deer pops into view. And she looks at it and goes, oh, a deer. And you can see the saliva coming out of her going.
And you say, well, this relationship is never going to work.
But the nice idea about this idea of a third object is it's a totally separate thing from them, but it totally reveals their character. And what it did was, again, it followed the rule that everybody does, which is don't tell it, show it. And these writers found incredible ways to set situations up. One of the other interesting things is that Jeffrey and I were having a discussion at the beginning, sort of hypothesizing, what are we going to find? And we were curious, are they going to be more character-driven or more story-driven? To which we found out, they're both wrong. They all did the same thing. They said, conflict. Comedy is all based on conflict. And they found ingenious ways. Charlie Peters, again, had my favorite line in the book. He said, the hero of every story wants the story to end on page 2. Right. And so everything is obstacles you set up till he can finally get to the end. But they set up amazing conflicts, and they had very different approaches to conflicts. Tell about Leonard's.
Well, I was saying that you have Heidi Perlman and Leonard Stern. Leonard is a legend, going back to Get Smart and The Honeymooners. He said that he creates comedy out of kindness and out of people wanting to do the right thing.
But conflict's out of love. And
it's all conflict, but it's coming from a place of love. Whereas most of the writers in the book, and most particularly Heidi, the conflict is what would you call it? Spite?
Oh, hostility.
Hostility. And at the end of our interview with Leonard, we told him this, and he said, well, you just haven't met very nice people. But
it's really interesting.
It's really interesting to see how different.
Well, it's like the difference between people from New York and people from Los Angeles.
Exactly.
I think New Yorkers are always misunderstood because my friends from New York, they'll look at me like, hey, Danny, that is the ugliest jacket I've ever seen. Whereas opposed to Los Angeles, people are like, oh, what a nice jacket. Can you believe he's wearing that jacket? It's a two-faced kind of thing.
No, but Leonard's view was so nice. He would say, I've got two characters. I've got a mother and a daughter, and they both want what's best for the other. They just happen to conflict horribly.
Right.
And you get great conflicts, but there are two people who both are being thwarted in terms of helping the other person. And half of the I Love Lucy shows you saw used that basic idea. There were families, they all wanted nice things for each other that totally got in the way. He says, we don't have to kill people and we don't have to maim them and hit them with our cars to have conflict.
Okay.
It's an interesting view.
The book is called ShowMeTheFunnyOnline.com is the website. ShowMeTheFunnyOnline.com. Anybody can buy it. There's also excerpts of interviews from all the different authors, and that gives it. But
when you said can, you meant should.
They should. Well, I think they can buy one if they want, but people.
No, they can buy multiple.
People have told me that it's usually the third or fourth one they buy is always their favorite one. So, and what I like about the book is I'm a sucker for any kind of little anecdotes, especially little Hollywood anecdotes. But it really is as a practical guide for writers on how to write, because I was just fascinated again with your premise and how totally different these authors, the writers, took that premise. What was the the best part about writing the book for you, Jeffrey?
The best part about writing the book for me, and I'm not sucking up to him because I can't get it, is really working with Peter, who works so differently from the way I do. And that was the most fun. And to meet all of these, I had known some of them. No, I'm the room monkey.
I take turns.
I take my pants off a lot, actually. No, I think that it was just getting to be in the room with these people, these wonderful, very diverse people, for sometimes 3-4 hours at a time. What you're getting in the book is a little. We have the full interviews. We're going to start bidding on them.
Yeah, you should make that the book version here.
Well, what's going to happen is we also have. They're not up yet, but very soon we're going to start putting up 5-minute video excerpts of the interview, so you can actually get a sense of who these people are.
I think the other great thing about the book, and what I found the most fun, was Peter was talking earlier about devices. We had writers talking about things like knock-knock jokes. Not knock-knock jokes, what are they called? The turnaround joke, which is the classic, I'm not going to that Chinese restaurant and being the next scene. We had one writer tell us that he would never use it, that if they were there till 1 a.m, he'd find another way to do it. And another writer had no problem using it. The other thing that I learned through doing the book is how, if you can, there's back in the day when my dad was, you see, I've been teaching, I'm getting all their grammar, but my dad, I remember, would be writing a Ben Casey one week and a Farmer's Daughter or whatever, or McHale's Navy the next week. That really doesn't happen anymore. You're either a comedy writer or a dramatic writer. And what I've learned from doing the book is all of these people are accomplished in many different. We have Sherry and Bill Steinkellner, their Broadway play is just opening, which is the adaptation of the Whoopi Goldberg movie, which I think Whoopi Goldberg is producing as Sister Act. So they can move between worlds if they're professionals. And that was really stunning to me, because we're at a time when the executives don't know that.
Well, and how different was it from when you wrote, Jeffrey? Because I know I'm looking at your resume, it's like a biography of a great 80s hit show.
I came in at the very end of what was known as the stable system, where they would bring in as many writers as they could find. I don't know what happened in drama. I only did one dramedy, which was not a happy experience. But Remington Steele. But they would screen the pilot, and then you would come in and pitch ideas and hope to get an assignment. And up until, I think, 1977, which is a little before me, they were actually there were like, I think, 38 episodes a year. That's why we have so much product for Nick at Night and TV Land, because they did. And then, you're too young to remember this, but Dinah Shore would go off, and then there'd be 13 weeks of somebody else replacing her. That's the real fun of the book. That, and also I think the more serious side of the book, which is also hopefully fun, is that students and professional writers get to see that there's lots of ways to attack a problem and borrow it, steal from it. That's what the writers.
Did you ever have to write a very special episode of Night Court or anything?
No, my episode of Night Court was written by, they made us do like a 50-page outline for a 40-page script. But I'll tell you what they still do on sitcoms. You can tell a sitcom's in trouble when they do It's a Wonderful Life episode. You know they're done. So,
well, I was talking once with some writers from Cheers, and they had said that it drove them nuts when they asked, let's make a very special episode of Cheers, Sam's drug addiction or something. But I thought they gave a really good tip on writing, which always stuck with me, is they said, if you're really a good writer, they had read this great script, and it was about this uncle that appeared at Cheers, and everybody, the entire cast loved it. They're like, this uncle's hilarious and stuff. And I think it was Burroughs said, no, scrap it. And everybody was just stunned. And he said, no, if you can't write for my characters, you don't know how to write. And I thought that was a really interesting thing that he said. A good writer.
Particularly on shows like Taxi and Cheers.
Well, Leonard Stern wrote a book called A Martian Wouldn't Say That, which is about a history of comedy writing and knowing your characters well enough to know what they would say and what they wouldn't. One of the things that was really fun about doing the book is that we wanted to create as much of a feeling of being in the room as possible. And so some
And
of
you
the
accomplished that. You
and
did.
some of the writers were, in pairs, so they brought the room with them. It was great. But some didn't, and Jeffrey and I got to interact with them. We got to riff and play ideas back and forth, and it was really kind of fun. The thing that amazed us, every writer, I think, just about everyone, mentioned at some point or another in the interview that they were nervous doing this. They all said, we've done tons, hundreds of interviews, but we've never been on the spot like this. And some of the more courageous ones literally said, we realize that we're being compared to very, very elite peers, and we only have an hour to come up with something great here. It's when you talk to people who talk about writer's block and stuff, this is, okay, start doing the premise now. And the camera's on, and every one of them performed.
Everyone delivered, yeah.
It was, they were all just able to do the task and come up with something totally original.
Well, it's a really easy book to read. Again, let's get the website on there. It's called Show Me the Funny Online.com is the website.
Or smtfo.com if you just want to use the first letter.
There we go for our
people who are
part of the audience.
Typing challenge.
Well, it's a really easy book to read because that you can really just, I call it a great bathroom read because you can read just one writer at any one point. Do you guys have plans on writing anything else together?
We have a bunch of other projects that we'll be working on. Yes, this is too much fun not to do more different kinds of projects. But,
we really love doing it.
But right now we're having so much fun with this one still because. Well, tell them a little bit about using it at LMU.
Just briefly, I gave the book, and so did another professor, to each student. I put them in pairs, and I said, pick 3 of the interviews, come in, discuss the interviews really briefly, what you learned, what you might adapt, what didn't work for you. And then we use this thing which was developed at UCLA called the 2-minute movie, which is basically a movie developed out of a premise in 2 pages, because Lou Hunter, the professor who developed it, said if you can't outline the movie in 2 pages, you couldn't possibly do it in 50. If you can distill it, you can write it. So I had them go from their own premise, using the techniques and devices they found, discussing the techniques and devices, and then going from premise to story, which is exactly what our writers in the book did. I say our writers like we have some kind of proprietary. We felt that way, though. Well, but that's exactly what we're doing, and we're hopeful that it'll be a slightly new way to teach, because unfortunately, Danny, one of the problems at universities that I've found, oh boy, there goes tenure, is that teachers get into an idea that there's only one way to do it, and it's really about character and conflict. It doesn't matter if it's comedy, drama, or in between. I mean, you just look at the movies this year, and it's all about conflict and character.
Yeah. Well, the book is called Show Me the Funny, and you can find it at showmethefunnyonline.com. Thank you so much, Jeffrey and Peter, for being my guests. Folks, remember, people make a difference every single day. You can too. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next time, please.